Are you ready to embark on a transformative journey of rebuilding your life? Look no further than the Rebuild Podcast. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that nurture personal and spiritual growth. Through the wisdom of the Word of God and practical applications, we'll guide you towards becoming the best version of yourself. On this podcast, we will delve into a variety of topics and insights, ranging from mental and emotional well-being to personal development and spiritual growth. Together, we'll explore the paths to healing, resilience, and the restoration of inner peace. Subscribe now and let's rebuild our lives together, one uplifting conversation at a time.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rebuild Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Romy, and today I want to talk about separation. Now, most of us think of separation from the standpoint of going through the process of divorce, or putting one element on one side and another element on the other. In other words, sorting or trying to protect ourselves, things along that line. Now, those do have relevance, and those are, necessary. And maybe in another episode, we might talk about that type of separation. But this type of separation that I'm talking about today is going to be more geared towards a certain misunderstanding, if you will. And the reason I want to go into this is a revelation I had reading a certain chapter out of Leviticus earlier, and there was a certain revelation that came to me from this perspective. Now, there was a lot of other revelations too, and I try not to dig too deep into those, just because those can be their own entities, if you will, and then also because of the age that we're in, I don't want to create any awkwardness from that standpoint. But from this particular chapter, there was a lot of nuggets that were presented in this regard, and I had a lot of dialogue with God about this. So I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to talk about the revelations I had. I wanted to talk about some of the things I found as a result of this. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into this thing. Now, I will go like we normally do and define separation, or to be separate. And the reason I want to do that is this kind of ties into understanding the dynamic of some of the misconceptions or the misinformations that we've been given in terms of the whole separation aspect, right? Because to make matters real simple, we've been looking at this essentially wrong, or from a one-dimensional perspective, when this idea has a lot more meaning to it, or a lot more depth to it, or a lot more dimensions to it. So to separate as a verb in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary is to keep or to set apart. It is to make a distinction between, to sort, disperse, to set aside for a specific purpose, to part by a legal separation, to sever conjugal ties with or contractual relations with, to block off or isolate from a mixture. It is to become isolated from a mixture, to go in different directions, to cease to live together, to sever an association of some sort, an injury. I mean, obviously, if we're familiar with sports injuries, then we know what that means. And it also means to divide into constituent parts, right? So everything is being sorted accordingly. As an adjective, it's the same. It's kind of the similar thing. To set or keep apart. It's in solitary. It could be not material or not shared with something else. It could be estranged from the parent body. It can exist by itself, right? Not connected to something else. Or it could be dissimilar in its nature or its identity. And this, like I said, this kind of ties into some of the misconception we have with regard to the separation piece. And in reading Leviticus chapter 15, God is talking to Moses, and he's talking to Aaron about the unclean person. Now, with regard to the unclean person, there's a male aspect and there's a female aspect, and both of these things kind of deal with a certain type of infection. And this type of infection, now it's not sexual in nature, but it is something that is abnormal. And the dynamic behind this is when the person recognizes that there's something wrong, and they come to know that something is a little off by what they're experiencing. Most times it's either controllable or uncontrollable, but whatever the case may be, they have to live isolated for a little bit of time, right, in order to allow for the process to take care of itself. Not only this, but there's a breakdown of every aspect and detail taken into account for what happens with the person that comes into contact with this person, or anything that person is coming into contact with. So God tells Moses and God tells Aaron that, the person who's dealing with their linens or who's dealing with certain items, they'll have to clean those things. And in the process, they'll have to wash themselves, and they'll have to be, they'll have to wash their clothes, and they'll can be separated as well for a short period of time, right? Because you have to deal with the stuff. Makes sense. And in certain dishes or, certain ware that's been used, like cups or vases, jars, things of that sort, might have to be destroyed, or they might have to be cleaned or burned before they could be, before we can carry on. All in all, there's a lot of detail with regard to what a person is allowed to touch, to clean, not clean, and the whole ordeal around these issues, the male and the female issue. As I'm reading this, God kind of took me into a place of bringing me back to 2020. Right, we're all familiar with what just took place a couple years ago. That was the COVID pandemic. And you think about how we took some very, very serious precautionary measures. Some took them serious, some didn't. Understandably so. But there was a lot of controversy surrounding this thing. And again, as I'm reading this, God is kind of working with me on this, and like how, if the person touches this and this person touched this, the person that touched the thing that the unclean person touched has to do these things, and they'll be considered unclean for a certain period of time. And the person that, once they're healed, they have basically to isolate themselves, and then there's something that they have to do in order to bring themselves back into the normal fold, right? Almost essentially like what we experienced in relation to COVID, right? Someone who tests positive for COVID has to be isolated. They have to be separated from everything else, and everything has to be really deep cleaned. There's a lot of, detail. There's a lot of emphasis on ensuring that this thing doesn't spread, because the COVID could spread just about anywhere. In the same sense that this issue, right, not saying that these things are deadly, but to have certain types of things happen, come into contact with certain types of elements to said issue, it is kind of awkward to, if you think about it. I know, like I said, I'm trying not to get too graphic because I don't want to go too far into that, but if you want to look up the male issue and the female issue, you can definitely look it up, and you can see that there's certain elements to both sides, and they're both, especially in the female regard, it's outside of the normal construct of what a typical cycle is, right? And then for the male, it's not necessarily a cycle thing, but it is something that is abnormal. But coming into contact with the remnants of those issues definitely have their place, right? We don't want to come into contact with, or we don't want to associate or affiliate with that element itself, right? And then to take into account, you don't want to touch anything that, you don't want to touch anything that has the remnants of that on there. So there's this dynamic, right? And that's the same thing with the COVID, right? I don't want to come too close into contact with another person that may have it, because it's an airborne infection, and if I just so happen to breathe it in from a person that has it, and it attacks my body, now I'm out of commission for a while, and I have to deal with the consequences and repercussions of this thing attacking my respiratory system, right? It might affect me in such a way that I might feel flu-like. I might not be able to handle certain functions. I know some people had a hard time coughing or sneezing, just the way that it impacted their lungs, right, their chest, that whole thing. There's, like I said, there's a lot to take into consideration in that regard. The same is said with the way that we, again, put the precautionary measures out for how to make sure that a person is cleared to come back into normal or mainstream society, right? You had to be tested, and you had to showcase that you were clear. Like there was no sign of this thing regressing, right? Because some people, after a certain period of time, it looked like everything would be okay, and then they might regress, or because the symptoms might not have appeared, or because things might have looked better at one point, they might have gotten worse, so now you have to take extra time. From some of the areas and avenues I've worked with regard to this, there have been people that have gone into regression or gotten into worse situations. Some people have been hospitalized behind this and having to live on certain elements. There was a guy that I didn't know, but there was a guy that we had to track at one point that he had to retire as a result of this thing, because it was so detrimental, and that though, like, these things happen, right? They took part. So in this regard, there, we carried ourselves a certain way, and like I said, one of the aha moments I had from this came as a result of thinking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And one of the things that they had in common with this element is the notion that they would be, they couldn't associate with or affiliate with those that were not necessarily in the fold, because they had a responsibility, right? They had to maintain a certain connection to God In other words, they had to make sure that they were in right standing. They had to make sure they were following the law to the T. They had to ensure that they were doing what God required of them to do. Now, from the onset, from the early part of this particular element, it makes sense. They were in good standing because they knew what it meant. But like most things that happen over the course of time, these things kind of get lost in translation. Some people might take their own matters into their own hands, might lead into their own kind of interpretation of what these things mean. And I can imagine that that's what happened with these guys, to where suddenly they got to feeling as if, they were living from that place. And we can see elements of that in other forms of society. I was talking with my mother about this a while ago, and I think of the element of discipline in this regard, right? A lot of us are familiar with the idea of spanking, and some people are opposed to it, and they're, the understanding behind that. I get that. And then you have some that are supportive of it. And in some cases, again, I can understand that dynamic. However, when thinking about the element by which the format for this thing, especially if we just leave it to American history, where this comes into play, right? This becomes the option to keep people in line. Now, the process doesn't necessarily change. It still stays. It still has its impact, and it still has its same routine. It changed its face. I'll say it that way. Right? Anytime we see people speak out on a specific thing, they're suddenly quieted, or things along that line. Right? And all of this to keep people in line. There's a control factor. We can go into that in another element. And I think we actually kind of talked about that with regard to the respect fear and the terror fear. So if you're familiar, if you want to go back and listen to that, you could do that too. But it all falls into that category as well, right? It's a control mechanism. It's a coercion mechanism to get people to fall in line. And I think about that when we consider that which was used as a means of torture in some cases for us, because of what we've experienced, because of what we've gone through, we've now turned that, and we've quote tamed it to an extent, but we've made that the method by which we learn, which, if we go back and we look at what that really was supposed to be and how it was implemented and used, we wouldn't want to use that. And I'll be perfectly honest, during the time that I would actually be around my kids, or I would spend time with them, that would be the last thing I would do. I would try to utilize other methods in order to leave that element alone. I didn't want that to be a thought process, right? And ironically enough, my brother and I were actually talking about this not too long ago, and he was talking about how he remembered watching Run's House, and how he actually talked to the kids, and he taught them lessons that way, through his words, not through reacting, and what that did, and the impact that I had. And again, I think that speaks volumes, right? Because that does a lot more with regard to the subconscious as it does with the conscious. And I think, again, and from that same vein, we can find this same element in regard to the way that we kind of carry ourselves as a body. And I think this is one of the reasons why Jesus, or God himself, was so opposed to the idea of religion, right? Because religion tries to put that element of separation in the wrong place, which we're gonna talk about, right? But from this chapter in Leviticus, the whole concept behind the separation had nothing to do with the people. It had everything to do with the illness. And that was the thing that got me, right? Because even when we carried ourselves, the way that we carried ourselves in regard to COVID, there were a lot of people that became really antisocial behind the idea of being afraid of catching COVID. And so, instead of allowing ourselves to be able to live and interact and deal with people, we just chose to completely just cut off from everything. You had some people that, that did catch it. They knew they had it and would, selfishly go and spread it around, which that was also painful. Then you had some people that were just flat out rebellious and just didn't care. Like, oh, well, I won't believe it until it happens to me, right? And all of these things in that element, we can see how it plays in the body of Christ, because a lot of us carry ourselves that same way. A lot of us will become rebellious behind the idea of certain aspects to the movement of God. Why would I do this? This isn't cool. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this instead. Or I don't have to worry about that. God's going to protect me. Right? As it says in the Bible, we're not supposed to agitate, right? When it says the word test, that's what it means, to agitate, not to actually put the word to the test, like to try it out, to find out find out. This is to agitate. This is to stir up. This is to intentionally frustrate or antagonize God. And that's what some of us do. And then we find ourselves in trouble, and then we're asking and crying for help. We can find a lot of people trying to find the basis for what's supposed to be and how it's supposed to be, and everybody's getting into the idea of conspiracies and other things of the sort. I'll admit, as a person who was in the military at the time and they were pushing the whole vaccine element, I really didn't like it. I didn't buy it personally. And I still have some remnants of disappointment behind having to take it in order to complete my last year or so in service. But I also understand that it was necessary for the long run. Right? I also knew, the more I would try to fight it, the less likely it was I was actually going to be able to get it. And then on top of that, all of the extra, work that would have to go into trying to figure out if this thing would be worthwhile. It was too much. I got to a point where I just said, you know what, I'll just let it be and let God do what he does. I don't want to find myself being that rebellious. There are some things that I do stand on in terms of disagreeing with as status quo. And there are some things that I can understand, okay, I might have to utilize a little wisdom, just let it be. And this was one of those. But from the standpoint of this movement, the pandemic, right, everything that was, the way that we carried ourselves, the way that we did things, the way that we considered looking at another person or looking at each other, the small protocols. I remember the 6 feet of separation, right? That was a big deal. And I remember time and time again, I'm 6'5.5", so everybody that I come into contact with is going to be somewhere between the lower part of my chest and my upper leg area when I get to standing around them. And having been stationed in Hawaii during this point in time, that was a healthy range, right? Because I did find a lot of people at that at that size around my upper leg area, and that was kind of interesting. But to have the stickers, right, or to make the judgment in some cases, to see where 6 feet actually was, it became really uncomfortable. And a lot of times I would find myself, if I could bear it, because I was also dealing with other issues at the time too. If I could bear it, I would actually allow other people to go in front of me just so I can ensure that I had 6 feet of separation behind me. I could gauge, I'm not gonna say I know, but I could gauge what 6 feet is in front of me. But I didn't necessarily trust people to stand 6 feet behind me. And it was always uncomfortable, especially when time started to change, or, the process got a little looser, and then we found ourselves maybe, okay, 6 feet is okay. I could do 3 feet. And then, when things start to get a little bit more relaxed and kind of get back to normal, there's still this dynamic of, well, how much space is actually okay, And then when we got to the point where things kind of got back to normal, and I started feeling uncomfortable again. Like, I got all these people around me because people were still catching COVID. In fact, I had a friend or coworker that I had that had actually caught COVID a couple of times after the pandemic kind of, basically became a normalized thing. It was no longer the pandemic anymore, right? But again, the whole idea, even in that process, was, us looking at or creating the idea of distance and separation and really trying to avoid getting sick. And from that perspective, that's what we are supposed to do in a spiritual sense. We don't want to attract the sin factor, right? That's what we're separating from. We're separating from the sickness. And that's what God is wanting us to see. And in reading Leviticus 15, that's what he's talking about, right? We're going to have to separate ourselves from the uncleanliness. But in order for us to do that, and in order for things to kind of can carry on and to be normal or to get back to normal, some of us are going to have to get dirty. Now, why is that important? Why would that be important? The importance to that is found in the way that the new covenant is established. Jesus Christ is the one who comes in and pays this sacrifice, right? He pays and atones for our sin. He becomes what they were describing in this chapter and most of the Old Testament. Because prior to you getting to Leviticus 15, you see throughout the rest of the time that you see Moses and Aaron talking to God about what laws need to be established. And even afterwards, you see him describing different types of atonements and sacrifices and the dynamics to what these sacrificial animals would have to be, right? It had to be a lamb or a bull or a goat that was a specific age and without blemish, right? It couldn't just be any old thing. It had to be young. It had to be in a different place. It couldn't, even with the birds, it couldn't just be any old bird. It had to be a specific bird. And these birds and these cattle were used sacrificially. They had to be offered up a specific way. And if you take into consideration how we were going, there might not have been enough sacrificing to go around, right? When you think about that in the grand scheme of things, because sin is still gonna sin, right? I know that's the modern day talk, right? When we say that whatever verb is going to continue to whatever that verb is. But to be honest, sin is still going to sin. It's going to still be here until the end of antiquity as we know it. But if we're multiplying the way that we are, and we get to a point where there's no more animals because we've had to sacrifice them all, then what do we do? Because sacrificing people would be just absurd when you really think about it. And I know that sounds kind of, but again, think about that. Like that, and that's not what God intended for, and that's not what God wanted. So you can imagine, like, God saying, okay, we're going to create something different, and him bringing his son to come and atone for us. He became that covering. He became that atonement. And as a result of doing that, now he's opening the door for us to not have to worry about going out and dealing with those that are afflicted in that place of sickness, right? So that we can heal them. And we don't have to go through the process of having to go through some extravagant ceremony. Now, in Leviticus 15, the people that did the cleaning and the people that did the ceremony, they were held to a different standard. Those that were associated, dirty by association, as long as they cleaned themselves up, they washed themselves, they bathed themselves, and they washed their clothes, right? They were good to go. They were considered unclean until the end of the day, and then they were fine, right? And you think about, we go back to the COVID element. If you were, if the person that come to be was a positive, you went into quarantine and you were being, checked on. You had to go get tested first, obviously, to make sure that you were negative, but you went into quarantine to ensure that, nothing happened to you too, right? And you wanted to make sure that once you got the negative test and you allow the days to happen, you were able to go back to normal. In some cases, you were able to go back to normal a little bit faster than the ones that were actually positive because you had no signs or symptoms, right? And then you kind of ripple effect it out, right? The associated of the associated, and you kind of go from there and figure out who's who and how that goes. Because in the event that something does happen in terms of a breakout, you want to be able to corral that as fast as possible so that it doesn't spread even further and become an even greater breakout, which, having been in the military at that point in time, I've experienced a couple, not firsthand, like I wasn't a part of them, but again, from the place that I worked for, we had to come up with a lot of different ideas to accommodate for some crazy things that have happened as a result of, elements like this. Some people were being careless. Some people were guilty, or, they were considered close contact, right, by association. So they had to quarantine themselves for a little bit of time. All these other elements. And it gets really scary when you think about that, right? And like I said, the way that separation goes, we're looking at the separation from the standpoint of, we don't want to become infected, which is understandable. And that's what God is looking for. But the thing that he doesn't want, and this is the thing that we typically do without realizing it, is we tend to associate the person as the sickness and not the sickness as the sickness. So then as a result, I'm avoiding the people because I don't want to get sick, as opposed to I don't want to, I should protect myself to avoid getting sick. That separation it's something that we have to be able to discern. And in that discernment, if we're being totally honest, we have to look at this from a different perspective. And this is why, again, like I said, I had some of these aha moments. You go back into the element of where these people were at the time, right? Them going in, they were headed into the promised land. They had just left Egypt. And these guys were being put into a position where they were being prepped for the promised land. So they had to unlearn a lot of the bad things that they had learned being in captivity and in bondage, and now being put in a place where you're being sifted through until you get to the new place. You have a new mindset, you're cleared, you're clean, you have a fresh slate, you don't have to worry about anything, and you're good to go. In this process, God is giving them things to practice in the natural that showcase a representation of separating themselves from who they're surrounded by. Even though they might not have been in the promised land yet, they were still surrounded by other people, different walks of life. These people carried themselves a different way. Right? We're familiar with certain customs of the markings, which for a lot of people, you know, they're talking about the whole dynamic of we shouldn't have tattoos and what that looks like. I'm not saying you should, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but in the context of that time period, the people that had the markings that were, you know, quote, cutting themselves and inking themselves and marking themselves were doing so from a ceremonious position to honor the dead. And that, even though, and some of those designs might have looked really cool. I don't know. But what I will say is, living in that environment, if you're doing what they're doing and you're trying to do what they're doing and what I'm trying to do, it's going to be hard for you to be able to go into this new place because you can't commingle, right, in that place. And I'm not separating you from the people. I'm separating you from the corruption, right? The attitude, the mentality, the mindset, the things that they value, right? The markings were a representation of the dead. I am the He that brings you life. You can't associate death and life together. Those two don't mix. You can't you can't worship some of the things that they worship because they're worshiping things, and in a literal sense, they're worshiping things, and you have me. You know I exist. All I'm asking you in this worship element is to follow me, not what they're doing. Yeah, they look like they have somebody in a place that leads them, and that's great. But my purpose for you was never to have someone over you, someone that you followed. And in that place, it makes a lot of sense if we really sit down and think about it. If we have someone that we become that dependent on, that's not ordained of God, and in some cases, even being ordained of God, we put too much stock in value in the person more so than we do God. And we can see what that looks like in today's day and age. You think about some of the religious leaders and what that looks like. Like, no disrespect to some of the other religions and the other denominations in the body of Christ, and no disrespect to any element in that regard, but we put so much high value in those positions of leadership. In the church, that's a great example, right? I remember growing up and being in the church, and whatever the pastor would say, that would be considered law. Even if there were things that the pastor was saying that sounded contradictory to God's will, we would take it as such. And primarily based on the notion that, well, it's in the word. And it might be worded as such, but that might not have been what was meant. And sometimes it could be out of a a well-intentioned place. I remember once being told about praying for the end of gang violence and how that's an unwinnable prayer. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, I could see where that is. But what if it's not about ending gang violence, but maybe stopping the spread or the continuation of it? Like, I'm not saying that we have to allow these guys to just kill themselves off, because it's still going to kind of perpetuate in that regard. But what if we figure out what the root causes are behind this thing in the process, and then we can attack that, right? Because that's what God opens that door for. That's why we have to be open to that discernment. And again, this is what he's showing me in this regard when reading this particular chapter. There's a lot of separation that's being done, but it's not being done for us to look at the idea of separating ourselves from the people. Because you think about the people that weren't in leadership. You think about the guys that weren't Moses or Aaron or the council that was actually attached to them, or the priests that had to do the sacrificing, the official ritual, right? The cleansing ritual. Those guys were responsible for the way that was interpreted and the way that looked. And in essence, everyone was. But those guys especially, because they were given the instruction. Now imagine being given an instruction and you misinterpret the instruction and you spread that to the people. Now if you do that the wrong way, now you're finding yourself in a bad spot. Because now all of these people believe that whatever it was you told them. And it's going to be hard to get them to unlearn that and to relearn something different. And you think about how many different people there are, and just about as how many different people there are, that's how many different interpretations we have of this thing. It's pretty heavy when you think about it. So then how do we help with that? We ask for the discernment. And we find a way to present this to where people can see it and relate to it. Like I said, me reading this, immediately I thought of COVID. I don't even think I got all the way through the first part talking about the issue of the man. I actually went to look it up, like, what is this? Because I'd never heard of anything like this. Like, anytime I've heard of an issue, it was mostly geared towards the women folk, and that's outside of what their normal thing is. And I actually did my first sermon was actually kind of based around this. It was based around that woman with the issue of blood in the New Testament. And so I was aware of what that was, because I had actually kind of researched that and figured out what that was all about. And I was mind blown by it. Like, oh wow, I didn't know that was a thing. I knew the other thing was a thing, but I didn't know that was a thing. Like, that's wow. And when you think about that magnitude in and of itself, that's a big deal, considering how long she had that. But in that same vein, now I'm thinking about, well, what would the guy equivalent to that be? Because how, what? And then I find it and I'm like, oh. And the first thing I thought of was, well, wait a minute. If that's the case, then that could be, because the way that some versions interpret it, it's more so based in if you leave it open, then it's based in the idea of any time a guy does, have that type of activity, then, obviously you're considered unclean from that point, which that takes on a completely different meaning. And then that renders everything else useless. And I'm like, that doesn't add up. Why would God create something in this regard and then call it unclean? So I'm like, no, that can't be it. So I looked a little bit further and I found out, it's the same thing as the female side. It's tied into, and I was like, okay, that makes more sense. So it's not something that, is I was like, okay, got it. And now I can see why that issue would be what it is and how that plays itself out and what that looks like. And okay, got you. Now these things that we have medical advances in today's day and age to be able to handle both sides of that spectrum, right? But back then that was completely different. So, you can imagine having to be separated for that purpose. And again, the element of being considered unclean behind that because of what you have to do. But some of those people had to still help out, right? You think about, say you're a husband and wife, and that was included in there too. So if you have that to consider as well, what if you guys come together? Now that's another element to consider, right? That's another thing to take into consideration. You think about the children in the house. The children have to come into contact with the same things that the parents have to come into contact with. And they have to clean, and they have to clean themselves, and they're considered unclean for a certain period of time. And you can see now, when you're thinking about the separation thing, now you're having to think bigger picture. Like, I can't just willy-nilly go do whatever I want. I have to be very mindful of who I come into contact with, what I'm coming into contact with, especially if I'm in knowledge that there's something wrong. Right? I might have to say, you know what, in the best interest of me not affecting or infecting any of you guys or putting you at risk, it's best that I go somewhere else and separate myself while I get myself together, get myself clean, get myself the help I need, so that you guys don't have to suffer, right? Because that could potentially be a thing, right? You don't want to spread that, because that kind of spread can turn deadly. Like I said, we've seen that with regard to the idea of COVID, right? The people that we were most concerned about were the children, right? Especially those that were really young, because that has an effect on them. You have those that have health conditions, right? Certain sizes, certain other underlying issues such as heart conditions, and then of course the elderly, right? Those were the three types of people that we were all concerned about. And if you met a certain number of those requirements, you were considered high risk. And so you're given even more special attention, and there's more consideration for you to, maybe not be out in public, or, maybe you have things done for you so no one has to, so you don't find yourself in the process of, being caught up in certain things. And we saw what that looked like. We had during COVID, we had an increase of people who were considered essential workers that were doing, Instacart shopping and we were doing Uber Eats, and like I said, some of those stores remained open so that people could still get certain things that were needed, that were necessary. So, and of course there's all the different rules and stipulations and regulations to that. Hey, when you show up, you pull up to this point, you leave the thing here and knock 3 times, and I'll know that it's you, and then I'll wait, and when I hear you drive off, I'll go get the stuff, or whatever the case may be. Like, we had parameters around that to ensure that no one was intentionally going in the wrong direction, protecting ourselves. I just so happened to fit that criteria of being what was considered high risk. I was a bigger guy at the time, and I had an underlying issue that the command I was a part of actually knew of. So, for them, they were taking that in consideration. I wish they had done a better job of that, to be honest with you, but they had taken that into consideration. And when they they made the decision for me to leave, I didn't like it, to be perfectly honest. And from the standpoint of, worst case scenario for them, if I were to catch it while on deployment, heaven forbid that would have happened, but if that would have happened, there's nowhere for me to go. I'm basically I'm stuck, and heaven forbid the sickness actually would get worse, and, I end up passing away. That would be a terrible thing. Be even more terrible for you guys is then there's nobody here to teach you some of these lessons, right? I wouldn't be able to share this with you. But yeah, that being said, that level of discernment, right? Us looking at this dynamic and recognizing that the separation had nothing to do with separating ourselves from each other, which is what we eventually focused our attention on, and associating the sickness to the person and not the sickness from the person. We find ourselves operating in that same regard as a body of believers. We associate the people to the sin. We associate the people with the sin. We associate the people in the sin. But we don't associate the people, or we don't disassociate the people from the sin. The sin is separate from the person. And I know a lot of us, we teach the dynamic that the sin is in the person and the sin is the person. And we were born in sin, but we weren't born sin. And I think we really have to grasp and understand what that means. To be born in sin, yes, it's the same element, and I think it was Paul that wrote it, right? Being in the world, but not of it, right? I'm here. I live, I exist in this element, but I'm not a part of what the rest of mainstream society says is the cool thing to do. That's the same thing with the sin element. Yes, because of what happened with my forefathers, Adam and Eve, them eating the fruit and disobeying and all of that, and them eventually having Cain and Abel, and from that becoming the 12, 13 billion of us that we find ourselves connected to. Yes, I was born in sin, but that doesn't mean I was born of sin. That doesn't mean that my identity is sin. That's separate from me. Right? Because if we were to, and let's take that and break that down for a second. If I identify with the sin in that regard and I make my identity as that, then what I'm also saying is what God says about me is completely false. It contradicts what he says. Right? Because we say out of our mouths a lot that we were made in God's image and likeness. And if I'm made in God's image and likeness, that means that I have his character. In other words, I was born of God. I was born in sin, but of God. Now, some people might think, well, that logically, that just doesn't make sense. From a logical perspective, I get that. right? Because, well, how can you be born in sin and of God at the same time? That just, again, the way that we were created, right? We were created in his image and likeness. So if we can agree to that, and if we believe that that is true, then we should know that our character is his character. And again, because we've identified the sin factor more so than we do the God factor, it's easier for us to lean towards and accept the idea that we are sin more so than we are God. And I know that's going to throw a lot of people off. That's why you got to take a moment to let that register. Yes, we were born in sin, but we were born of God. That being said, we have to disassociate from the sin. We have to recognize the sin is not us. That is not our identity. That is not us. We are separate from that. It's in us, but it's not of us. Just as much as we say that we're in the world, but not of the world. It's the same principle. This is part of the reason why it's imperative for us to build that faith, right? To know who we are in faith, because without it, how else will we be able to come into the knowledge that something like this, right? The separation is not necessarily to separate the person and isolate them and reject them. Because again, we go back to the definitions. Yes, we are isolating, right? But we're also severing our connection to this thing, right? The person who has the issue, right? Once they come into the recollection that everything is okay, right? They've been considered clean from the standpoint that they don't have the issue physically coming out of them anymore. They have 7 days, right? They give themselves 7 days. They isolate themselves from everything else for that time period. And then they are to go and perform a burnt offering. 2 birds that the priest will take. One is a sin sacrifice and one is a burnt offering. And he will offer them up. And once this ceremony is complete, you are considered clean. You are considered free from affliction or infliction or disease or whatever you want to call it. So there's no more issue. How does that apply in today's day and age? Again, we made mention of this earlier. Jesus came and became that sacrifice for us. So as a result, now that his sacrifice became for us what we would have had to do with 2 little birds, every sin, we're now covered. His atonement or his death becomes our atonement. And as long as we're in alignment with him, we're covered. This also helps us because now we can use our experience. We can use the pain and the suffering and the lessons that we have learned as a result of being contaminated to help other people to recognize that they were also contaminated so that they can come out of contamination so that they can be considered clean, quote, free. And so we're sharing this knowledge, this wealth, this freedom, this opportunity to be clean so that we can become what we're supposed to become. And again, it becomes a recognition of a different type of separation. I'm not rejecting you because of what I see, right? I'm not saying, oh, well, you fornicated. Shame on you for the fornication, right? Because that's how we carry ourselves, right? You did wrong. Shame on you. But think about when we were in that position and we did the wrong. And yeah, some of us might have had that experience and that might have set us straight and that might have been what we needed. But everybody isn't privy to that. Everybody's not accustomed to that. This is also where the discernment comes into play. Right? Some of us get excited about the idea of, calling out someone that was wrong. And a lot of it can stem from the trauma from us being put in that place. Some of it could be the trauma based in the fact that we were wronged and we feel justified behind this, right? That could be a subtle way of us being able to look our offender in the face, even though the offender isn't the actual offender, but we can look at the offender in the face and we can call that offender out. Right? I've been in situations like that too. And it is uncomfortable, right? Because you're being judged based on something that didn't necessarily happen through you. Right? You weren't the guy that did the thing, or you weren't the girl that did the thing, but you're being treated as if you were the person that did it because that was triggering to the person on the other side. But when we have that discernment, when we recognize the idea that, the saving, the separation, the discernment, the right kind of separation opens us up to seeing that, it's not the sickness. It's not the person, it's the sickness. Why? Why is that? Because if I focus on the person and I ridicule the person and I separate the person, that person is going to emulate the same thing. And now they're going to push another person away, who pushes another person away, who pushes another person away. And now you're wondering why it's so much more difficult to bring people in and to save them, and to heal them. Because we focused on the wrong element. Right? God tells us all the time that he loves us. He hates sin, but he loves us. Right? That's the same element. He loves us. He loves the fact that you're a happy-go-lucky person, or that you make jokes, or you like to have fun, or that you have elemented talents. Right? You can sing and dance, and you can play sports, and you can make music, and you're a thespian, you're a master of the sciences and all these other things. It's a beautiful thing. But then he hates the fact that there's this thing within you that says that I'm going to do it my way. I don't want to follow in this God thing. Because that means I'm not allowed to be X, Y, and Z. And I want to enjoy myself. Right? Misinformation. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Right? Trust in the Lord your God with all your heart. Lean not into your own understanding. And again, I go back to the Pharisees and Sadducees, and I think that is what happened over time. Kind of the same thing as what happened with Pharaoh, right? The specific Pharaoh that found himself really disconnected from the whole element of Joseph. And you're thinking about that's generations down the line. Why is everybody why are we getting along so well? And who are all, and like, these people outnumber us, and this is starting to become a problem. Why are we even on good terms with them in the first place? Nah, that stops today. I think that's the same thing that happened with these Pharisees and Sadducees. They found themselves so far removed from these humble beginnings that they, again, they disassociated themselves. And you look at the way they carry themselves, right? They carry themselves as, I can't touch you. I'm not supposed to be around you. I'm not supposed to do this. I'm not supposed to do that. And you think about the way that some of the other elements of stories happened, especially in the New Testament, right? The casting out of demons. They knew how to cast out demons, but they probably did it a specific way, right? They couldn't just do it. They had to, it had to be some kind of ritual. It had to be whatever the law said it was. They might have had some really great discernment, but they adhered more to the law than they did to the will of God. Right? In other words, they separated God from his word. That's not what God intended for. And in the same regard, we as the church, we kind of do the same thing. We separate God from his body. Like, again, no disrespect to all the different denominations and the different the sects and the subsects and all of these different, bodies and entities that find themselves governing the people, saying that we're all supposed to be one body. There are so many different conflicts in the idea of how we see God. Some people say that there's one God. Some people say that there's three. Some people say that, some people say that there's only the whole entire holy book is basically the first 5 chapters of the Old Testament. Some people don't acknowledge the New Testament. Some people think that it's based, you have to be dressed a certain kind of way. Or some people think that, they really take into account what a man's position is and what a woman's position is and how the children are supposed to be and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And there's all these different elements, and many of them don't even tie into God's will or purpose. And we find ourselves saying that, well, this is God's design. Like, it's not. Because we've separated the wrong kind of separation. Going back to, again, the notion of separating the person from the sickness. That was the whole point and purpose behind the isolation. So the person could be free from the affliction. Not to call them the affliction, because they weren't the affliction. Let's talk about even what that looks like in the modern day. And this will be the last thing we talk about before we go. Right, a lot of us, when we look at the element of having things done to us, the people that wrong us, right, we live off of the notion that we fight not against the flesh and blood, but against the principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, evil wickednesses in high places, and all of these spiritual elements. We say these things out of our mouths. But if someone were to say something to us, or if someone were to do something to us, we hold that person and the action as one. I remember listening to a sermon, and I remember we were talking from the dynamic of forgiveness. And in this dynamic, we often talk about forgiving the person for the sin. But we never really forgive the sin. Or we forgive the sin and not the person. But it's very rare that we actually forgive the two. And the third element being ourselves. Right? Because sometimes we find ourselves being victimized, or we blame ourselves for things happening. And we never take the time to really separate the three of them as separate. We treat them all as one. It's lumped all into one thing, and we say one prayer, Father, forgive them, and make peace, and that's it. And even then, we don't even address or come into clarification on, how we feel behind that thing. We might not talk it out. We might not deal with it. We might not heal from that place. We just kind of sweep it under the rug and pretend as if it never happened, and then, oh, I forgive you, out of our mouths, and then we keep it pushing. But then the way that when we see that person later on, we're holding them to a certain fire. Oh, you did this thing to me. Oh, you did that thing to me. Oh, you did this. Oh, you did that. And then we wonder why. We often wonder why, there's so much resentment. And it comes from that same place. We're not holding ourselves true to separating the person from the sin. Not only that, we don't really discern it the way that we're supposed to. Right? Recognizing, okay, the person that committed the sin is only doing what the sickness is allowing them to do. And if I recognize that that sickness is what needs to be separated from the person, okay, it's easier to forgive the person now. Now I can address the sickness. Okay, let's focus on this sickness now. Those are the people that are taking the clothes and washing the clothes. I still have to do a little work, right? Because by association, I have to ensure that I'm cleaning myself. And when you think about what that looks like, I might be the person to go and help you through an issue or a problem. And if I'm not careful, I might find myself becoming irritated or frustrated or upset or agitated because I'm in a sense bearing your uncleanliness. And in bearing that, there might be some remnants of that thing on me. So now I have to clean that up. I gotta clean it off. I gotta get that off me. And allow the thing to be removed. And this is the reason why, again, like I said, I had the aha moment. I recognize that this is one of those things that we've really kind of failed at. We've kind of dropped the ball on this one, because we've put the wrong type of separation into play. We've put the wrong type of association with the separation into play. If we separate the right things through the right discernment, through the right understanding of God's will and purpose with God's word, then it makes life a little bit easier to navigate through, and we can recognize, okay, this is what really needs to be said and done, as opposed to us going based off of some old ritual that has nothing to do with God's will or purpose. And in this process, I pray that we find ourselves being able to be open to receiving that level of knowledge and understanding and wisdom to know how to approach these things, how to approach the people that are afflicted, because that's our responsibility. Not to be fearful of getting contaminated, because that contamination, if we're doing the right thing and if we're doing right by what God says, just like these men and women in Leviticus chapter 15, that is only going to last but a temporary bit of time. Like Paul says, if he's becoming all things to all men that he might save some, you might have to go back and reflect on a moment or a time period that you might not be too proud of. But at the end of the day, you know that you've overcome this thing. So you're not necessarily reliving it. And you're doing it to help the other person to come out of that place that they're trapped in, because you know the way out. So let's practice learning that association so that we can separate the right things in the right places, so we can move the way that God wants us to move. Father, I thank you for today. I thank you for the implementation of your word. I thank you for the revelation that you've given in regard to separating the sin or the sickness or the affliction from the person, and recognizing that even though there are going to come times where we're going to come in contact with those that are still afflicted or infected or that are sick or that are wrong or in the avenue or the realm of sin, that we have to go through that process of being able to go into the place and help them and clean up for them and make the situation that they're in easier, so that when they come out of their sick place, when they come out of their affliction, when they are deemed clean, they have a clean environment to go back to, that they can find themselves reintegrated with a group of people who are willing to help them and cultivate them and grow them the way that your will and purpose states that you want us to do. Father, I ask for forgiveness for us as a whole for not being able to recognize this separation, that we rejected many a soul, for not understanding the dynamic of the separation, the proper separation, because we've taken certain things the wrong way, taken certain elements too literal. Forgive us, Father, for becoming what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. And I pray, Father, that we embody and we embrace what you were showing us, because we've been covered. You are gracious, you are holy, and you are wonderful. And I thank you, Father, for this time and this opportunity. And I pray that your will be done in all of our lives. I love you, Father. All these things I ask in your holy and heavenly name. Amen. I thank you guys for taking the time to come out and listen to us today. I do apologize if there were some things that were maybe given, maybe not directly, maybe indirectly, that gave rise to some elements. I really was trying not to become too graphic because of what I was actually reading, again, Leviticus chapter 15. But I will say that I do pray that we do find ourselves operating from the place that God wants us to operate from, and to practice the discernment of knowing how to separate the illness from the person. Just as much as we say that we're in the world and not of it, we may have been born in sin, but we are not of sin. We may find ourselves not believing that we have the wherewithal or the giftings to be able to do the things that God gave us the power to do. But I pray that we find ourselves recognizing the power, the essence of our true identity in that image and likeness of God, so that we can help those that are sick, both in a literal sense and in a spiritual sense. It's part of our job, cultivating heaven on earth. I love you all, and until next time, this is the Rebuild Podcast, and I'm your host, Sean Romy. Take care, and I pray you all find your purpose. Peace.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. Tune in weekly as we dive into topics such as finding your calling, overcoming obstacles, building resilience, and strengthening your relationship with God. If you're ready to embark on a transformative journey of faith and personal growth, then join us on the Rebuild podcast. Together, let's build a solid foundation that aligns with God's will and leads us to a life of purpose and fulfillment.